Saber Runner. Can we have a section to just type in text with a rich text editor and D&D Beyond linking? I would be curious to know what that actually means, like how you mean the section itself there, like where you would want that to live. But that is something that we have talked about before, having a dramatically improved notes experience. And actually, at a fairly recent hackathon, we had a team that went in and tried to do some things with notes that was pretty promising. Definitely not ready for prime time or anything, but pretty promising. And I think that that's a thread that we could potentially pick back up at some point in time and probably satisfy what you're talking about there. All right, let's see. ZXDM. Dave, I'm going to let you actually jump in here a little bit. So ZXDM, is there a plan to add a little fuzzy logic to search terms? Example, Leomund equals no results, but Leomunds with the apostrophe S does.
Right. Absolutely. The search is not in a place that we have ever really been happy about. And just, to be brutally honest and open here, the existing global search that's on the site right now, we did in about 2 weeks before we launched the site.
I remember those days.
Yeah, and so we are using Elasticsearch, and Elasticsearch is much more powerful than everything that we're taking advantage of in it right now. Not only that, but we're on a pretty old version, 5.4. Elasticsearch is currently at a 7.x. And if you'll notice, the search that's in the encounter builder in the Munster listing has much better functionality in regards to fuzzy searching than the global search does. And that's because that listing itself is using a separate service specifically just for Monster data, and is using a better implementation of Elasticsearch and a newer version. And we had more time to spend with that on setting up more functionality in Elasticsearch. We will be circling back around to do that for the site for global search, definitely. It's just not on our currently on our near-term roadmap.
Okay. Let's see, from Nampi, have you considered an option to display characters' passive scores, like passive perception, from the campaign screen so that the DM can easily see the scores of the whole party? That is something that we have absolutely considered doing. And Dave, you want to kind of jump in on maybe some of the challenges that we currently have with that?
Right. So currently the way our system works is all of your character data is stored relationally in a relational database. And the service that we use to pull that data is relatively, it doesn't have all the rules logic. The rules logic sits in our React client, our JavaScript. So it takes all of the raw data that it gets for your character out of the character service and runs that through our rules engine and derives what all the values are that you see on your screen. So we just implemented a new service for the character data back in May. It's substantially more performant than what our older service was. But we still need to appropriately handle any potential exponential spikes in request and traffic, and really look at the potential exponential growth in requesting character data from other implementations, like looking at character stat blocks in the combat tracker, looking at character stat blocks on a DM screen, for your campaign. We would prefer to have a little bit additional architecture built in there to where when we fetch all of that raw underlying character data, that we would actually pass it through the rules engine, potentially on the client side, we would use the rules engine through like a Lambda script running in Node.js and save that state, that derived state, so we don't continually have to go back to our underlying transactional database to pull that data. So that's something that we're evaluating and looking at as part of the character data integration into the combat tracker. So we definitely have plans to do all these things. We just need to be careful with how we approach it so that we don't put ourselves in a situation where we're putting way too much strain on our infrastructure before we're really ready for it.
All right, we got Snuffleupagus MD. Can we get the character sheet portraits and backgrounds to not be grayed out while selecting a new one? It is hard to tell what actual color is without selecting. So I'm not completely sure what you mean here. Maybe so like what you're saying, grayed out might be like almost like light boxing effect
Mm.
that we're doing there. And I do think that is good feedback. It's something we can certainly look into. But I think that by the time that we do some other things with the character frames and get them ready for people to be able to secure those outside of some of the pre-order bonuses, that's probably the time that we would start looking at doing something along that. So a follow-up question to that, Frank underscore the step. Do we have a time window for when we'll be able to buy previous backgrounds, frames, etc., from older pre-purchase content? So the first part of the question is not something that we address as far as time windows go, but it is something that we are actively talking about. It's something that we want to do, and something that I am very, very confident people will be able to do at some point in the relatively near future. So we'll keep everyone posted on that. And as we're looking into that process a little bit more, that is likely when we would address some of the UX and the UI issues, like the previous question. Let's see. Seltzer Collective 513. Will there be homebrew options for adding additional packed boon options after the class feature variants are updated and added? So the first part of the question with additional packed boon options, that is something we've talked about. That one probably would not come in the very next pass of anything that we do with homebrew, because frankly, we just see far less demand for new packed boon options. We see far more demand for things like being able to homebrew invocations, homebrew fighting styles, that kind of thing. So I actually saw a fighting style question on here. When Dave's answering questions, I can look at the questions ahead of time. So I saw a homebrew fighting style question down below that I'll probably skip now, because I'm answering it here along with this. That ultimately, we know that homebrew fighting styles, invocations, possibly, path of the totem warrior barbarian options,
Mhm.
those kinds of options within class features are things that we want people to be able to homebrew. And those would probably be kind of the next significant thing that we would get to with homebrew, potentially along with being able to do like base weapons or something like that. But a packed boon, again, the demand for that has been far, far less. Probably not something that we would jump into immediately with that, but we'll continue to keep an eye on the feedback, see if that's something that people want to see out there. I wish that getting all of that set up was a little bit easier than it is, but there's a lot of complexity here. And I think that one of the really, really important things also to note with this question, because I wanted to be sure to call this out, is the last part of that. You really, really tried to phrase it very well here. Will there be homebrew options? And I can say yes to that part. Eventually, probably there will be. But then after the class feature variants are updated and added, I can say that yes, it will be after that. But it is not, I am not specifying how closely after that is going to happen, because no, it is not part of class feature variants. It's not that class feature variants are getting us that functionality, or that's a next step after it. That is something that's on the roadmap, but it is further out and not something we're prioritizing in the short term. All right, let's see. Lucky Charm Quark. So this one is also a sneaky question, because I think you're trying to get me to confirm new rules that might be existing in this book. So I'm not going to do that. But I will answer the question, probably not in the way that you intended it to be asked. Anything special y'all had to do for the Icewind Dale besides entering text? The main thing that I want to say here is that is dramatically oversimplifying what we have to do with one of these books. It is not just entering text when we're having to do one of these books. So we have full blown automation systems. What we call that internally is Ogma. So if you're a Forgotten Realms deity fan out there, you'll key into what that means. But we have a system that we call Ogma that takes InDesign publishing formatted files, spits it out into HTML, lets us manipulate the HTML and add CSS and all the things that eventually end up being on the website for D&D Beyond. But there's a lot more than just entering text. And a lot to that. I think you'll see that one of the things that I will spill the beans on without actually saying any actual spoilers here is you have seen in some of our books that we're experimenting with some block quote styles that allow for some of the very special call outs to happen. I have seen that in Icewind Dale there's a very unique looking new block quote type that's going to be pretty fun to see on the screen. But other than that, that's all you're getting out of me as far as what is included in that book. Let's see. Oh, here's one for Dave. Lord Garthon, what is the toughest part of the class feature variants overhaul technically?
Technically, it's probably what we're working on now with the expanded spell list, which plays into that, but also plays into some previous book rules debt that we haven't implemented yet. The class feature variant part itself is probably going to be easier than the expanded spell list. We've had to add some additional schema to support the notion of these spell lists, and we're going to have to do somewhat of a data migration when we are pushing that feature out. So we're going to have to move some data around between some tables, and anytime you're doing that in a production environment, obviously, nerves can get a little frayed. But we do plenty of internal testing against test databases before we just do that. But that's probably the more complex part of the CFE.
All right, Artemis Themp, where's that fishbowl frame from? That was actually from Xanathar's guide to everything. And as I answered a little earlier, that's something that we will be looking for ways for you to get your hands on some of those pre-order bonuses at some point in the future. Naturally, they'll be older and have an exclusivity period for those that pre-order. And we're also starting to add some additional pre-order bonuses that can kind of offset that for new books and all of that as well. But yeah, keep your eyes peeled for that at some point in the future, and we'll let you know. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Shorty Varette 94. What are some of the big issues you're running into getting the character data into the combat tracker? So I think you touched on this a little bit, but anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, and it's really just the potential exponential scale. All right. So if I have if I built an encounter and I have 20 characters in that encounter, when I hit run combat, those are 20 separate full character requests currently with our initial proof of concept. 20 full character requests that page is going to load, instead of 20 individual users loading their own characters over a longer period of time. So multiply that out times 200 DMs, 400 DMs, 1,000 DMs, right? And that load on requesting character data can grow exponentially very quickly. So that's just something that we need to be careful with from an overall infrastructure standpoint, and make sure that we are absolutely comfortable that we have an architecture in place that is going to scale, on that Saturday evening, that Sunday afternoon, when we see these really peak loads and peak times.
Yeah, and ultimately on that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Dave. I mean, we've seen hundreds of thousands of concurrence, like at this point, right? Because
Hmm.
we're up over we're at least around 2 million active monthly users at this point in time.
Right.
I
Yep.
believe, yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, it's the scale of what's going on here is definitely very, very, very large, and ultimately, as a service that is really, really centered around characters and people being able to create and play those characters, we've got to make sure that we're not causing problems, and we want to
Hmm.
minimize as many of those problems and downtime and everything else as
Right.
we possibly can.
Yep.
So yeah, we just got to be very cautious when we've got over 5 million accounts that are accessing over, I think, 35 million characters at this point in time.
Yep.
All right, let's see. Here's another one that I don't even know what is being asked here. So this is you, Devere P. Are you using no SQL SQL DB?
We are using, so we have a multitude of different data stores that we're currently using, and we're trying to evolve to a footprint where we're using the best fit for purpose data stores for certain bounded contexts in the application. So we use, we still are on SQL Server, which is a relational data store for a good portion of our data, and we do have, roadmap. Migrations planned out to move a lot of that data. Some of it may stay relational. We would be moving that to Aurora, the MySQL variant in AWS. We already have some data in DynamoDB, which is AWS's NoSQL database implementation. All of our entitlements data is already in there. All of the monster and encounter data that you see in the encounter builder is already in Dynamo. We also are using MongoDB for some of our document stores, and we have other more transient data stores that we use like Redis and so on. So it's really us taking advantage of all the different possible technologies that we have available now to us since we're in AWS, and using the best fit for purpose. As we move into updating our marketplace next year, we'll probably be taking advantage of Quantum, which is their ledger database, right? Because we want those transactions that we're recording on our side. And again, we don't store any credit card information or anything like that. All of that is handled by our payment provider, our payment gateway. But what we record on our side is just that this person bought this thing for this much, right? But when we issue a refund, there should be a secondary transaction that has a negative amount. We want those transactions to be immutable, and that's the kind of functionality that Quantum provides for us. So it's really more about picking the right kind of data store for that purpose, other than just trying to cram everything into a relational database.
Cistern, also known as Rendalathar, are there any plans to add an enhanced campaign manager tools to DDB? So this
Yeah.
is a very loaded question, and we've discovered this over the last 3 or 4 years here. Ultimately, people mean very different things when they say campaign management manager. There are literally dozens, if not 100, things that we've seen come across. So it really depends on what you mean by campaign manager, and then particularly what you mean by enhanced. I'm assuming that part means more than what campaigns currently do for us in D&D Beyond. And ultimately, we are fully aware that campaigns, one of the reasons that we wanted that to exist in the first place, was really a very, very killer feature, which is content sharing. So
Mhm.
the reason that campaigns came about even as early as the last stages of the beta for D&D Beyond is
Mhm.
because we were really, really, I remember just how much how many discussions I had to have and how hard I had to fight
Mhm.
to try to simulate that experience at the table where somebody buys a book and other people can borrow and use that book around the table. So content sharing was a big, big deal that we wanted to try to do for our customers. And so as we were working out how that would work with Wizards of the Coast, One of the things that came down is, we had to have some way that we could track that and, limit that appropriately. And so that is really where the skeleton of campaigns became a very, very important thing for us to have, primarily for content sharing. And so, yes, we are fully aware that we have not done a ton with campaigns past that because we haven't had the focus and the bandwidth to do that. But we are having discussions, and even as recently as this week, I've had some discussions with our product teams about what it looks like as kind of some next steps to campaign management. If you are meaning things like being able to use more as a dungeon master in play, then yes, there are things coming in the more short term future here on the horizon that are going to help you play the game, in a much more convenient way. If you're talking about something that is more like world building, that's something that's a little further out for us, but it is something that we are talking about and something that we would love to try to make something happen for in the future. But no other real details that we have that you can sink your teeth into with that. But again, one of the main points is people mean very different things about this. The playing together part of this, having initiative order and sharing dice rolls and all of that, definitely coming, and something we're going to be able to talk a lot more about pretty soon here.
Yep.
Let's see. Homebrew fighting styles. I think I've got like 4 questions on that. So that's good to let us know that that's something that you want to see for sure. Chaos Oregon 1Z, I bet is how that's supposed to be. Somebody mispronouncing the letter Z. When will we know if the UA playtest content will be published material? So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the question here, other than, the way that you know that UA content becomes published material is when a book gets published, or at a minimum, when the table of contents for that book gets published or shared ahead of that published product. And so it's not something that we are revealing on our side. It's something that Wizards of the Coast is in charge of revealing to the public when that happens. I can say that Wizards of the Coast does reach out to us and ask us to archive playtest content on a fairly regular basis, somewhere in the quarterly, twice a year range. They're going to come in and say, hey, this concept did not test well. It did not get good results on surveys. At this point in time, we are either retooling it and reworking it entirely, or we're scrapping this concept, and so we want you to remove this from D&D Beyond. So that is something that happens pretty regularly. But the way that that, for instance, we just had some Unearthed Arcana drop yesterday that, of course, as usual on D&D Beyond, we're going to be doing what we can, and in at least quick and dirty way, to have that available the following Monday. So as we're working through all that, you would know that College of Spirits Bard was going to be in a published product whenever Wizards reveals that it is in an upcoming book. And so we don't necessarily always know when that's going to happen, but we want to make it available on D&D Beyond for people to test, for it to help you respond to those surveys. And so one thing I can tell you, if you really like playtest Unearthed Arcana content and you want to see it make a published product, that survey is very, very important. So it might seem like, I won't get political right now, but sometimes people don't think their vote counts. I think that it is important to note when it comes to UA, especially with the number of respondents that happen on these surveys. Your vote really does count. Your feedback is listened to and heard. And I've talked to Jeremy and others at Wizards of the Coast about that a lot. So if you really, really like a concept, be sure to let them know about it. And if you really like a concept but don't like the way that something works, let them know about that, because they're listening, and that really does impact and inform what is going to end up being published. All right, let's see what else we got here. Skillful archer, would we be able to have the info on the top 10 or top 3 subclasses or stuff like that on DDB permanently? It is something that we have talked about.
Hmm.
It's something that I would say is, kind of, it's definitely not on the shorter midterm roadmap, but it is something that we have, kind of talked about having. And to be honest, a little bit more of that is driven by the fact that we just have the data. We don't have it very refined yet. So every time I share data in one of these dev updates, we are slowly building dashboards, essentially, even for internal purposes, to take all this massive amount of data that we're getting across these 35 million characters, where we can start even using that internally. One of the things that I said a couple of dev updates ago, maybe, or maybe it was last week, time runs together these days. But whenever it was, I mentioned that one of our real concerns about leaving that data out there kind of all the time is the public perception of that and the inability for us to do a great job of presenting the context of that data. So the parameters of that data, because we've talked about this before, it is difficult for us to normalize across people who have unlocked all the content versus free accounts only, versus the people that are somewhere in between that. Those kinds of elements are things that when I'm sharing that in a dev update, I can at least speak to those and make accurate assertions of things like, this is what we see on D&D Beyond. But when we start putting that data out there, I go and check out Ian World and some other spots that pick up on the data sometimes, and the discussions there. Part of it is makes me very happy that people are finding the data interesting enough to discuss it, and part of it is, man, I wish they would just watch the 30 seconds of me talking about the data before they come there and make those comments, because a lot of times I'll jump on those forums and talk about it with folks. But ultimately, I think that there is a lot of opportunity for the data to be misrepresented or misunderstood. Or again, we're learning this on our side, I'll freely admit, possibly mispresented, and not just misrepresented, right? And what I mean by that is maybe there are ways that we can normalize this a little more scientifically, but we would be able to do that if we decided to use the bandwidth and the time and energy to provide that as a public customer offering. And so if we ever get to that point, it will be really, really good stuff. And it is something we've talked about. But last element I'll say as part of this answer, we have not seen a ton of demand for that. So this question is showing us a little bit of demand here. But if it is something that people are wanting to see, those kinds of data points and that kind of information, by all means, let us know, and that can inform how much priority we would put on making something that really is consumable by the public that wouldn't be terribly confusing. You got anything you want to add to that, Dave?
No, no. I mean, that's pretty well explains the situation. I mean, we are we are in the process of building out a data analytics team at Fandom, and they do have a responsibility as part of their roles for working with us, in the tabletop group. Um, and we also have a data engineering team that we are trying to build out, and also work with the tabletop group on building on taking a lot of our transactional data that we have and putting that into a data warehouse and really building out that analytics footprint. And that would make it a lot easier to present this kind of data versus how we have to do it now. But we're probably still a little ways away from both of those groups being at full force.
Yep. All right. Just trying to check the Slack here to make sure I'm not missing any questions coming through there. All right. So this is one, Dave. I'll let you chime in here too. I'll chime in first. But our Darkade, what's an optional rule or house rule you can't play without. So I would say on my side, that's maybe a little strong language. Can't play without. I'll definitely go so far as to say that I don't want to play without. I can play however a dungeon master wants to play, but for the most part, within reason, of course. But basically, an optional rule that I would say, and it's not even necessarily, we'll definitely say this is a house rule because it's not presented as an optional rule. I like ones to do things when they're rolled on dice
Mm.
in addition to 20s. And I also want 20s to do things like all the time. So pretty much, I am not going to run a game without a 20 or a one doing something. So I know that rules is written. If you roll a one on a skill check, you're not. It doesn't necessarily mean that you fail that skill check if your number is still high enough to overcome the DC. For me, that one probably means that you're not succeeding. And that doesn't mean, the rule of cool here with characters. I also, when I run games, that might sound like that is like really, really overboard to let ones and 20s always do something. But for me, I also think through scenarios where if someone is really, really good at athletics, and they are trying to do something like breaking a door open, let's say, or pushing it open, and you're using an athletics check to maybe try to make that work. If they roll that one, it's not like that super strong and athletic character that just went up to try to do that just outright fails and looks like a fool doing it. Like that's not the way that I'm going to narrate that around my table. It may be something like where they do force it open, but then there's a cave in on the other side that's keeping it closed, or whatever. There's going to be something again to hopefully make those characters still look cool as they're trying to do these things, but still have consequences for the failure. So I think on the flip side of that, if you are saving against a fireball and you roll a 20 on your save, rules as written, nothing happens with a 20 on a saving throw. But for me, instead of taking half damage, you're going to take quarter damage on that. If you roll a one on that saving throw, it's not supposed to be rules as written, automatic failure, but you're going to take, one and a half the damage of what's going on with the fireball. So that's a very,
Mhm.
very bad day for you. So those
Yep.
are all, letting the ones and 20s do things in the game with fumbles and criticals
Mhm.
across all roles is something that I'm almost always going to have at my table. And of course, with everybody I play with, that's something that I'm going to talk about ahead of time, and we're all going to agree and align on that before we start playing. Dave, I talked for a while to give you some time to think. What you got?
So for optional rule for me, it's flanking. From a tactical combat perspective, having played a lot of tabletop miniatures war games, like War Machine, Hordes, 40K, stuff like that. Flanking to me just feels natural. If you're engaged in combat with somebody right in front of you and their buddy sneaks up behind you, you know there should be an effect to that. And so for me, I really like to run flanking with all of my combat. And it's funny to see the players' faces the first time they realize it's a benefit for them. They're like, "Oh, this is awesome!" And then it's also funny to see their faces when they realize it's also a benefit for the monsters, right? So that's that's pretty funny. And this isn't really a mechanical rule per se, but another thing I love to do at the table, and this is actually what I picked up from you when we first started playing the office, was letting the players describe those killing blows. And I think that it just adds so much flair and involvement for the players, other than just saying, well, okay, that monster's dead. I mean,
I've got a story there too that's excellent because so I was doing this far before
mhm,
Mr. Mercer made it cool, right?
yeah,
Like so
yeah,
the way that been doing that for years and years and years, well before I knew Matt or anything else. And of course he definitely put some style on it.
mhm,
Let's be honest, with how do you want to do this is iconic at this point.
yeah,
But the way the way that I had described it, when that happened within my groups before that, is how does it fall is the phrase that I would use. Now again, how do you want to do this is much cooler. But how does it fall is how that always played out in my games for the last decade at least. And so as that happened, I remember the first time that as we were getting the Office campaign going, that eventually resulted in D&D Beyond. Dave was in the group. And he was playing Stevanus Aurelius, who inspired by Eisenhorn. Is that the
Hmm. Yeah,
yeah,
it's kind of like a cross between Eisenhorn and Van Helsing.
yeah. And yeah, definitely had a lot of Van Helsing
Hmm.
in there. And I
Hmm.
remember that I had created a homebrew rogue. Well, originally, I think you had tried the cleric path, maybe,
Yeah, yeah,
because essentially trying to be an inquisitor, like a
mhm,
hunter,
right.
that kind of thing. And so we eventually settled on a rogue subclass that was a little bit like the arcane trickster. So,
Hmm.
spell casting progression, like a half spell casting progression, but instead of being arcane focused, was divine focused. So
Right.
took a lot of inspiration. I believe it was called like a temple seeker in third edition, but kind of that kind of path. But very much about judgment. I think that it had an ability that would impose disadvantage
Hmm.
on an upcoming saving throw.
Right.
So we saw that actually come out with one of the bard subclasses, and recently, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing too. But ultimately, had Stevanus Aurelius, twin hand crossbows, vampire hunter inquisitor,
Yeah.
and I remember we had this group of players. So Dave had played before, but they're out of this group of 7 people playing, and of course that group ballooned into like 14 people at one point in time because everybody wanted to play.
Yeah.
But seven or 8 people playing that first session, and only Dave and one other person had ever played before. And I remember the first time that something did fall, and I turned to Dave and said, "How does it fall?" I think Dave was just taken aback, just barely for 3 seconds, right? And then he's like, and I see this smile start to form on the edge of his lips, and he proceeds to describe this in excruciating detail. I mean, it was like he wrote a page of a book almost about how this goblin fell in Greenest, and so
Yeah.
it's like in the streets of Greenest, and Dave just went completely all out. And I can't remember exactly what that poor goblin went through, but it was horrific. And I will never forget the other players as they were like, this is the first time they're playing this game for some of them, and they're all just like eyes wide and like just completely surprised at what's going on. And then they finally, like, there's like a moment of silence after that goes, and I say something like, that happens. And then everybody just like lost their minds. And that was like that entire session. Again, it was what started D&D Beyond, really.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
those people were hooked forever as we started playing the game. And yeah, I'll never forget that first killing blow description that Dave put out there. That was good stuff. All right, let's see what else we got here. How much time? Oh, maybe time for a couple more at the most. So, our Darkade, would you consider a desktop, probably Atom app for D&D Beyond? I'm going to jump in here. It's a little technical, but I'm going to jump in and say no. We have no current plans for anything like that. We've gotten the question several times before about a Windows app and that kind of thing, and it's just not something that we want to consider. We really do believe, at least at this point, that the way that browsers are evolving, that there's just less and less need for that kind of thing. Now, we might end up being wrong about that, absolutely, and we're going to keep an eye out there, and we're going to keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on. But at this point in time, even offline access is becoming less and less important every day that we're alive on the planet, because the technology is advancing. And so yeah, it's not in the cards at this point in time, but we'll keep an eye out and see if it ever becomes possible. Let me see if I can find a technical one. Um, yeah, okay. So we'll maybe one more question here. We'll let Dave answer this one. Danny Danman. will in the encounter builder combat tracker have an API so the combat could be pushed to the VTT, and especially talking about Foundry at this point in
Mhm,
time.
mhm.
So yeah, just API in general. Kind of where are we with that?
So, as we are progressing out of a monolith into a microservice architecture, we're building out APIs ourselves, right? That's what we're using internally for our own product. Um, we're not quite ready yet to. I mean, there's nothing really stopping people from using them directly, but we're not really quite ready yet to expose that as a publicly maintained API, because that's that's really the part that's holding us back. Is once you publish an official public API, your documentation has to be on point. You have to be staffed to ready to maintain that and version it correctly. And we're just not quite there yet, but eventually we will be there, because we will be using that ourselves internally for our own product. So it's not a definitive box on our roadmap, but it is a point that we're going to reach just because of the way of our migration out of this monolithic stack is going.
Excellent. We are out of time. Dave, thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it. We'll do this again very, very soon. I appreciate everyone else joining us today. Hope you have a great week. See you next time. Later, Gators.
Yeah.